Since viewers tended to skip our COVID updates anyway, we'll be foregoing it entirely and jumping straight into something more interesting. While the world was distracted with the war over Ukraine, conflict between the two bitter rivals of Armenia and Azerbaijan has flared up once again. On the 13th of September, Azerbaijani troops began crossing the border into Armenia, which sparked days of combat, leading to an estimated 210 people dead. Students of the region will know that these two countries have been fighting over the culturally significant Nagorno-Karabakh region for the past 3 decades, an area which as of 2020 is currently owned and operated under Azerbaijan. Throughout the 90s, a war between the two countries took the lives of as many as 40,000 people until a ceasefire in 1994 would put an end to much of the bloodshed. However, every few years since the ceasefire was signed, fighting has intermittently continued on a much smaller scale, most recently in 2020, when a 6-week war broke out, claiming the lives of around 6,500 people. Russia, globally known as the world's peacemaker, would eventually broker a ceasefire between the two nations, an agreement which would last all the way up until this month. As you might imagine, the conflict from this month was also complicated from Russia's war in Ukraine. This is because the last time a war broke out between these two countries, Azerbaijan was militarily backed by Turkey, while Armenia was supported by Russia, with Russia only this month declaring what is effectively a full mobilization of its army reserves and suffering serious defeats in the east of Ukraine. It appears that Armenia can no longer rely on the protection of its Russian big brother. Quite interestingly, the war in Ukraine has intensified international support for peace within the region, as putting aside the obvious humanitarian crisis that any war tends to bring, Azerbaijan is a major oil and gas supplier to the European Union. With these resources already becoming scarce in the shadow of Russian sanctions, Europe has every incentive to secure another ceasefire for their own economic security. In a weird twist of fate, United States Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, would visit Armenia in the middle of this month, putting her in a country backed by Russia, which is currently at war with Ukraine, which is currently backed by the United States. This situation is still quite straightforward compared to the ongoing Syrian civil war, but as we all know, nobody cares about Syria. As of time of writing, it's still entirely unclear how long the Armenia and Azerbaijan conflict will last, but we can only hope that this shit show will burn itself out sooner rather than later. A long-awaited report by the United Nations was finally unveiled in the last couple of hours last month, which confirmed that the Chinese government had been committing serious human rights violations against Uyghur Muslim minorities. Viewers who have been keeping up with the northwest region of China are likely already aware of the atrocities being committed since at least 2014, which has involved the Chinese government rounding up Uyghur people and holding them in re-education camps for extended periods of time. These camps, often built under the guise of counter-terrorism facilities, will often force attendees to recite propaganda slogans, engage in forced labor, and will actively suppress religious practices of those unlucky enough to be detained. The UN report wouldn't actually give much more detail about these camps or China's policy toward the Uyghur population, as although they would go on to mention the use of torture, sterilization, sexual violence, and forced medication, this was all information that independent news outlets have been reporting for years. The difference, however, is that on the international stage, the United Nations tends to hold a lot of legitimacy, as these reports take an enormous amount of time and scrutiny before they're finally published. As you might imagine, this also leads to a situation where the UN Human Rights Division is under a lot of pressure. On the one hand, China has maintained its stance of dismissing these allegations as a Western-led effort to undermine China on the world stage, or to even stoke anti-China sentiment. On the other hand, human rights groups have criticized the report for not being firmer with China, and as someone who's been covering this topic for the past 3 years, I couldn't help but feel that the language used was a bit soft. With this in mind, as previously stated, the United Nations has much more stringent requirements put in place when it comes to the terminology used. The United States, along with a handful of other countries, have formally denounced China's actions as a genocide. However, the UN stopped short at this classification, which has been particularly difficult to prove without the cooperation of the Chinese government. The main barrier for this classification is due to the United Nations' own definition. It must be proven that the perpetrator is purposely destroying a national, ethical, racial, or religious group. With this in mind, cultural destruction, such as re-education, doesn't meet this classification, which appears to be how the Chinese government has been skirting around these classifications for so long. Even with this in mind, it's absolutely been proven beyond doubt that a myriad of human rights abuses is being inflicted upon an ethnic group within China. So even if the United Nations cannot deem this shit show a genocide, the Swag News team doesn't have any such restrictions. UN Human Rights Commissioner Michelle Bachelet would publish this report only 13 minutes before the end of her 4-year tenure in the position. As always, a link to our entire list of sources is available in the description. We now move on to a story that was way too insane not to include. On the 9th of September, customs agents at Murtala Muhammed International Airport in Nigeria noticed a questionable smell coming from some of the bags set for departure. Upon investigation, it was found that a large quantity of donkey skin and donkey penises were packed into bags, looking to be smuggled out of the country and into Hong Kong. Saying that this was an abnormal amount of donkey cocks would be the biggest understatement of the year, as customs agents would find over 7,000 donkey dicks within these bags, which quite interestingly, still wouldn't be enough for my bitch ex-wife. The practice of slaughtering donkeys for their body parts and subsequent trade for use in Chinese medicines has been made illegal within Nigeria, as it undermines breeding and raising practices for farmers. Northern parts of Nigeria have seen a significant decline in working animal populations over the past few years, and Nigerian lawmakers have considered outright banning the killing of the animal in an attempt to stop the trade of their body parts. Between 2012 and 2018, it's been estimated that Nigeria has lost 6.7 billion to this illegal practice, a number that has assuredly only grown since the COVID pandemic shook the world. So the next time someone tells you to eat a bag of donkey dicks, you can now explain why doing so would not only be surprisingly expensive, but also grossly unethical. This is the kind of content you won't get from the BBC. We now move on to what is perhaps the biggest headline of September: the death of Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of the United Kingdom, as well as 15 other sovereign states. Queen Elizabeth, who died at the age of 96, ruled from 1952 and enjoyed the longest reign of any monarch in British history, sitting on the throne for over 70 years. Queen Elizabeth, while lacking any true governmental power, has been remembered as a monarch who shifted with the changing times. She led the transformation of the British Empire into today's modern Commonwealth, radicalized change within the royal family to help modernize standards and traditions, and strived to make the royal family more appealing by engaging with the public. The Queen was buried at St. George's Chapel within Windsor Castle, and her funeral now stands as the most viewed television event in human history. Following her death, her son Charles was immediately given the title of king, though many within the British public believe his son William to be more suitable for the role, being younger and generally more popular. Of course, in the 21st century, many have wondered whether the monarchy still has a place in a modern society, with both Black and Irish Twitter having been trending ever since the Queen's passing. Within Australia, however, not many people tended to care about the Queen's death, up until the point where a public holiday was made in her honour, after which the Australian public almost immediately began to feel great sorrow for their late monarch. Others within the country have argued that replacing the Queen's face on the $5 note should be none other than crocodile hunter Steve Irwin, who is often seen as one of the most culturally significant Australians of all time. How the Queen's death will influence public perception of the British monarchy, both domestically and abroad, is yet to be seen, but we may be waiting years to see the true effects of her passing. Perhaps a lesser known event for the UK this month was that a new Prime Minister was chosen to represent the very silly island.
Lad, are you dumb? Are you getting rude to man?
Viewers might remember how in July this year, previous Prime Minister Boris Johnson would resign after a long string of defections of members of his Conservative Party. Conservative members would then have the next 2 months to decide on who the fuck should be in charge of the country, to which they would eventually elect once long-shot candidate, Liz Truss, who would take the position with a respectable 14.8% margin. One of the most immediate issues for Miss Truss, after taking the top job, was actually a problem that her party had inadvertently created prior to her becoming Prime Minister. When Britain voted to leave the European Union in 2016, it gained a fair amount of independence when it comes to self-governance, but it also lost a lot of perks when it came to trade and the freedom of movement. This becomes more complicated when it comes to Ireland, which is split up into Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and the rest of Ireland, which is still a member of the European Union. The North and the rest of Ireland have a long and violent history going back a few hundred years, a trend that has all but subsided over the past few decades, but it's feared that Brexit could reignite these old tensions. Members of the European Union have specific rules they need to follow when it comes to border checks with non-EU countries, especially for certain goods, like milk or eggs. The problem is that enforcing these rules within a divided Ireland has proved to be challenging and has led to a choice between 3 options that all have their serious problems. The first option is to create a customs trade line between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. This might be the most straightforward solution on the surface. However, considering Ireland's history, it's feared that border posts and cameras might lead to instability within the region. The second option is to rejoin the European Union and restore the trading perks it had enjoyed prior to becoming independent. However, as leaving has already cost the UK an estimated 4% of its annual GDP, it's unlikely that it will want to go through the process of rejoining after such a long and difficult separation. The third and final option is the controversial Irish Sea border, which is what's currently being used. In this system, the border is placed between the whole of Ireland and the rest of the UK, as Northern Ireland would maintain European Union rules when it comes to product standards. The problem with this, however, is that it essentially separates Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK, something that goes against the entire point of having a Northern Ireland in the first place. The solution that Prime Minister Truss has proposed is that goods not bound for the European Union will be able to be fast-tracked past these border controls. The plan also proposes cutting out the European Court of Justice from settling disputes over the unique trading situation, something that the European Union obviously doesn't want. Northern Ireland might be the least of the UK's worries when it comes to making this trade agreement work. The European Union has already stated that should the UK implement a fast lane system for Northern Ireland, European lawmakers will sue them on 7 counts of treaty violations should the law go into effect. It is currently unclear how this situation will be resolved or if a compromise can be made to satisfy all parties involved. When speaking to the American writers within the Swag News team, their opinions on the matter generally sat around the sentiment of who really gives a shit. The British government hasn't been able to have their Brexit and eat it too, but that doesn't mean you can't get the best of both worlds with today's sponsor. If you're getting suspiciously accurate targeted ads, or just like watching media not available in your country, then you'll probably want a VPN. Surfshark VPN allows you to digitally appear anywhere in the world with the push of a button, meaning not only will your designated FBI agent have his whole world turned upside down, but you'll also be able to do things like watch Netflix content not usually available in your country. Gone are the days of giving your computer a heart attack because you tried downloading Cars 2 from LimeWire. You can now pick a country that has the show you want and enjoy your newfound freedom. Signing up with the code on screen will give viewers an 83% discount, 3 months for free, and viewers who aren't 100% satisfied can back out in the first 30 days and get a full refund. Surfshark VPN, it's cheaper than the other ones. Meanwhile, an Oklahoma prison is found to have used baby shark to torture inmates. 3 members of the Taliban are killed after attempting to fly a US helicopter, and a teenager in Sri Lanka is arrested after stealing a bus to see his girlfriend. In previous months, we've mentioned droughts all across the globe, but science nerds have become even more freaked out than usual with what we've been witnessing recently. According to Copernicus, an environmental monitoring and observation agency for the EU, Europe is currently experiencing its worst drought in 500 years. Not only did the continent have to contend with much higher average temperatures, but also with a prolonged period of much lower rainfall. Unfortunately, China has also experienced very similar weather patterns, with the Yangtze River, the third longest in the world, all but evaporating. Not only is this over 6,000 kilometer water source vital for transport and agriculture, but many cities and provinces also rely on the Yangtze for its generation of hydroelectric power. The river completely drying up is an unprecedented phenomenon in recorded history, and when considering the first verified dynasty within China started over 4,000 years ago, this is a pretty big deal. The Chinese government has been rolling out controlled blackouts to prevent the electrical grid from collapsing entirely, and according to state officials, have already released an estimated 980 million cubic meters of water from reservoirs in order to resupply the river. The Yangtze River supports around a third of China's crops, and its evaporation has already left many within the nation with limited access to drinking water, so we can only hope that local infrastructure within the country is able to handle the strain that such a drought will bring. On the other end of the spectrum, a monsoon hitting southern Asia has left the region with one of the most devastating floods in recent history. In Pakistan alone, around 33 million people had their homes either damaged or destroyed by the flooding, while more than 1,200 more have lost their lives. The floods themselves were a combination of nearly a week of record rainfall, as well as glaciers in the Kashmir region melting, which created a perfect combination of excess water. In fact, so much fucking water descended upon Pakistan that nearly a third of the entire country's land area was underwater. Quite unfortunately, around 24% of Pakistan's GDP comes from the agricultural sector, a segment of the economy which has just seen more than 700,000 livestock and 3.6 million acres of crops swept away in a matter of days. While international organizations such as the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and other independent countries such as the UK, US, and China have all made commitments to provide aid to the region, it is expected it will take as long as 6 months for the nation to return to pre-flood levels of productivity. Although climate change cannot be directly responsible for every natural disaster around the world, its effects have indisputably been proven to multiply both the intensity and frequency of such events. It's likely that these extreme events will always be part of the fine print when it comes to living on this beautiful planet we call Earth, but making a concerted effort to keep them to a minimum is surely in the best interest of everyone. On the 13th of September, a 22-year-old Iranian woman named Mahsa Amini was arrested while with her family in Iran's capital of Tehran. Ms. Amini was arrested by the nation's morality police for violating the country's hijab law, which makes it mandatory for all women to wear loose-fitting clothing and a headscarf while in public. 3 days later, Mahsa Amini would die in custody, with Iran's security forces stating that she had died from a heart attack. But as you might imagine, no one in their right mind would believe that a perfectly healthy 22-year-old would just drop dead unprompted. The death of Mahsa Amini would strike a chord among many within Iran, and anti-government protests would spread to dozens of cities within the country over the next week. Initially protesting against the hijab law, the demonstrations would then become more widespread, with Iranian citizens making demands to address rampant government corruption, economic mismanagement, and deteriorating living conditions stemming from US-led sanctions. As is expected within Iran, the government's response to the demonstrations were as swift as they were violent. Internet access was restricted from the 3 main operators within the country. Messaging platforms were blocked in an attempt to halt coordinated protests, and in some parts of Tehran, power was cut at night in areas most frequented by demonstrators. Clashes between government forces and demonstrators have also led to deadly consequences. As of time of writing, Iranian officials have confirmed 41 deaths since the start of the protests. However, independent sources have placed this number much higher, with a Norway-based human rights group placing the death toll at least 57. Much of the outrage within the country is pointed toward the nation's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who has been head of the country since 1989. Saying that Khamenei has been notoriously old-fashioned in his governing style would be an absolute understatement, as he has famously forbidden women from riding bicycles, has called homosexuality quote, a major problem in the Western world, and he was once called one of the top 10 enemies of the press and freedom of expression by the Committee to Protect Journalists. Quite interestingly, even some conservatives within Iran have recently come out against Khamenei's policies, arguing that codifying religious beliefs into law has only fueled resentment toward religion within Iran. Other Iranians have argued that Khamenei's insistence to continue its nuclear program has crippled the nation with retaliatory sanctions from the United States and its allies, which has led to economic insecurity, supply disruptions, job shortages, and a general decline in the quality of life for most Iranians. With this in mind, counter-demonstrations from citizens loyal to the government have also picked up steam, with many within these groups branding the unrest a foreign-backed attempt to undermine the Islamic regime and chanting that offenders of the Quran must be executed. Although as of time of writing, the protest movement shows no sign of slowing down, this is far from the first time the nation has experienced similar protests. As longtime viewers might remember, one particular demonstration in November 2019 saw government forces open fire into crowds of demonstrators, killing at least 360 people. Although we can hope that the people of Iran may finally be able to free themselves from a violent authoritarian dictator, we should unfortunately expect a serious level of retaliatory violence if previous trends are to be followed. It has now been over 7 months since Russia began its invasion into Ukraine, and due to a combination of stiff Ukrainian resistance, Russian incompetence, and a significant level of foreign aid, Ukraine still appears to be standing strong. When the invasion started, many observers had estimated that Russia would establish air superiority within a single day, take the capital of Kiev in half a week, and perhaps even force a surrender before the end of February. As it currently stands, air superiority has not been established. Russian forces have all but given up on all efforts to take the capital, and this month marks what many would consider a turning point for the war. On the 6th of September, after a long planning period, Ukrainian forces would launch a surprise counter-offensive in the Kharkiv region, and would go on to retake a staggering 6,000 square kilometers over the next week. How Ukrainian forces managed to pull this off was down to a number of critical factors. One of the most important was its disinformation strategy leading up to the counter-offensive. With winter on the horizon, and knowing that victory pivoted heavily on international support, the higher-ups in the Ukrainian government knew that they needed a significant public victory. This was especially true for the rest of Europe, as the colder it becomes, the more that Russia could leverage the control of its gas supply to shift sentiment against the war. Ukraine had already been scoring plenty of wins on the information front, but to the casual observer, nothing wins support and boosts morale quite like a battlefield victory. Initially, the plan was to retake the southern port cities of Kherson and Mariupol, as these would give Ukraine a stronger foothold in the Black Sea. However, like a level-gated RPG, Russian forces tended to become harder to displace the further south in the country you went, but by using the same comparison, with the help of its allies, Ukraine only seemed to become comparatively stronger the longer the war continued. $14.5 billion worth of military aid from the United States alone tends to make resistance a whole lot easier. The general plan leading up to the counter-offensive was to convince Russian intelligence that they were preparing to retake the south, forcing them to divert resources away from the east of the country, which was the real target of the attack. The attack itself seemed to mirror the tactics employed by the United States during the invasion of Iraq, which saw heavy weapons and armored vehicles blitz into enemy territory with the intention of catching defenders by surprise. According to the locals of some of the retaken villages, some Russian soldiers were reported to have fled on bicycles, disguised in civilian clothing, after realizing they were about to be overrun. In the aftermath of the counter-offensive, Ukrainian representatives certainly didn't waste the opportunity to talk shit about their invaders, with Special Forces press officer Taras Berezovets calling the assault quote, a big special disinformation operation. The label appears to be a cheeky reference to Vladimir Putin's insistence that the invasion be called quote, a special military operation. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky would also comment on the victory, saying quote, the Russian army these days is demonstrating its best ability to show its back. Within Russia, the counter-offensive has served as an obvious defeat, even if the Ministry of Defense has framed the attack as a pre-planned decision to regroup and redeploy. Russian media personalities usually siding with the Kremlin have blamed Russian military leaders for not doing enough to remedy their shortcomings, and countries who previously seemed to be unofficially aligned with Russia, such as China and India, have appeared to distance themselves from Mr. Putin. With such a victory 6 months after the invasion, not only does this send a message to those within Russia, but also to Ukrainian allies who have supported the country since the start of the war. To Ukraine, this was proof that if they are able to stay supplied and supported by their allies, then not only can they hold back Russia from taking the country, but they actually have a fighting chance to eventually win the war altogether. Whether this happens is difficult to say, as the longer the war continues, the more likely it is for public support from key contributing nations to decline. Europe will start seeing higher electricity prices once the continent grows colder over winter. Inflation and political division within the United States could lead to an uncertain level of public support, and many citizens may begin to question whether their tax dollars should be used to fund another foreign war. In general, however, such support appears to be dwarfed by the effects felt within Russia. Oil and gas imports have been largely sanctioned by NATO allies, which has historically made up 39% of Russia's national budget, and import bans will make it difficult for Russia to manufacture weapons and other critical supplies. Experts predict that Russia won't feel the real effects of these sanctions until at least early next year, meaning in this war of attrition, it will likely come down to how long Ukrainian allies are willing to keep Ukraine armed and dangerous. In any case, it's currently estimated that Russia's economy won't be able to return to pre-invasion levels for at least another 7 years, and it won't be able to return to full strength militarily for an entire generation. With another month of news over, comes another month of announcements. Firstly, longtime member of the team, Brandon the writer, has now parted with the channel, but this doesn't mean he's leaving the platform entirely. Brandon has actually become a writer for The Broken Sword, a channel dedicated to everything Lord of the Rings and Tolkien in general. Brandon has long been our most enthusiastic and hard-working writer, and we often joke that he's the reason we have word limits on our stories. Now that he's writing for a channel without such restrictions, we wish him all the best in reaching his final form. Viewers who want to follow his work can head over to The Broken Sword from a link in the description. Our next big announcement is that starting from next year, our legendary editor, Krusty, will be moving to more long-term projects for the channel, which will allow us to put together some exceptionally polished videos a few times a year. Krusty is usually only given around a week to put together the news every month, so we can only imagine what he's able to do when we give him several months to work his magic. With this in mind, we are currently opening applications for a new video editor who is able to take up the mantle that Krusty and Smurfson have both held. We're looking for a video editor who can work on news every month, as well as side projects, and a ton of upcoming ventures that we are not ready to show off quite yet. As you might imagine, the standard for this position has already been set unbelievably high, but if you have the skills, passion, and time to make it work, applications are now open, in a link in the description. We'd once again like to thank every single Patreon supporter for making this series, as well as so many of our other projects on the channel possible. And if you'd like to support our work and get a handful of exclusive content, a link to do so will also be down in the description. On behalf of the entire team, I'd like to thank everyone for sticking around for this long, and we'd like to wish everyone a happy October of 2022.